My final project in Bio 318, which is over measles and the history of measles. Let's see here. As far as this disease being understood throughout time, the first case or recorded case of measles was identified in 9th century Persia. Fast forward to 1757, a Scottish physician, Francis Home, showed how measles is caused by an infectious agent in the blood. He was able to identify that and demonstrate that. However, at this time, miasma was still the leading epidemiological reason for transmission of disease and cause of disease. And the technology at the time, the labs and everything like that, they didn't really lend itself well to using this information to create a vaccine or a medication or anything for measles. So people continue to die from this disease, especially children. 15 years or younger, they are more susceptible to this disease than others. We've known that all throughout history. That's still something that's common knowledge today. In 1912, around this time in the U.S., there were reported about 6,000 yearly deaths from measles. Fatalities recently have been almost eliminated with the vaccine that we know today, but we'll get to that in a second. As far as changes in the way that this disease has been defined, there really hasn't been anything crazy different in the way this disease has been defined or symptoms. However, I do think it is important to mention that defining an actual case is important for this disease because it is so easily transmissible. So there were a couple of definitions that governments have come up with, and specifically here the U.S. government. Up until 1996, a measles case needed to be epidemiologically linked as well as clinical symptoms needed to be demonstrated to the physician before they could define a case of measles. However, in 1997, government got a little bit more regulatory, saying, hey, we need you to have a lab test to confirm the case of measles, along with the epidemiological link that you already established. In 1999, however, only 82% of measles cases were lab confirmed, and the reason for this not being 100% is that the government said, hey, if you don't have access to a lab or for whatever reason you can't get a specimen there, we're not going to make you say that there is not a measles case. We trust your judgment there. In 2000, the disease measles was declared eradicated. However, it did come back recently. We'll talk about that in a second here. But I do want to mention that defining the cases is important in determining an appropriate response, especially from a government body. The disease has been treated in the medical community differently over time, but I want to focus here on the vaccine that we know today as MMR. Like I said, the Scottish physician Francis Home identified something in patients' blood with measles. But in 1954, Dr. Thomas C. Peebles and John F. Enders, they isolated measles from the blood, and about 10 years later, they were able to create a vaccine for measles. 5 years after that, the vaccine was updated, and they were starting to play around with adding mumps and rubella into this vaccine, making it a combo MMR that we know today. However, we do know today that you get 2 doses of MMR usually instead of 1. Back then, you'd only get 1. That changed in 1989. There was an outbreak among school-aged children, and the doctors, pediatricians, decided, hey, we're going to have to add a second dose to the original measles vaccine. We're going to add 2 doses, or have 2 doses instead of 1. And at this time, it was MMR, so children would receive 2 MMR doses at different points in time as they were growing up. I do want to point your attention to 1997 in Romania. There's an interesting epidemic there. About 20,000 cases were identified. And first of all, here's just a graph of the span of many years here. In Romania specifically, there's an arrow here showing that the measles vaccine was introduced in about 1978. There was a drastic decrease in in cases after that vaccine was administered. The second dose was introduced in Romania in about 1994, and there was a little bit of a decrease there, as you can see, nothing too crazy. But in 1997, as you can see at the very bottom right, there was an increase there. And this epidemic is quite interesting, I will say, because it occurred mainly among vaccinated school children as opposed to unvaccinated school children. It's very interesting to think that a vaccine for a disease that is well understood still did not necessarily protect everyone from getting measles. However, there were only 13 deaths as a result of this epidemic. Let's go fast forward as well to an epidemic in the U.S., which we know happened in New York and New Jersey about 2018, 2019. This was primarily an epidemic among Orthodox Jews, and one of the responses the government and the schools came up with was to exclude unvaccinated children from schools. There were about, I should say, 81. One study says 81.2% of these children who got measles were 18 years and younger. In response to this, the government also, it's the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, a federal department there. They began to educate, or at least attempt to educate the the Orthodox Jews especially, that were resisting or choosing not to have their children vaccinated. After a large effort there, some Orthodox leaders were involved in encouraging this vaccination. They had to address lots of concerns among them and others about autism and vaccines, over-vaccination, and vaccine safety and efficacy. So they started these big educational initiatives to help people understand how these vaccines were safe and effective. And since then, at that time before the vaccine or before this epidemic, the number of people, the percentage of people, kids who had a MMR vaccine, at least one, was about 79.5%. After all these educational initiatives, at least in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in this one area, the number rose to 91.1%. And in this epidemic, there were actually no deaths as opposed to the one in Romania. So even though people were not as vaccinated as before, modern medicine was able to help them out a little bit. Nobody died from this one, fortunately. And here are my references. Thank you so much for watching my presentation.